All right, welcome everyone to Aionics Fortnightly. Today is February 16th, and today we're going to be talking about data-driven predictions of battery cycle life from early cycling data. And this is an area where there's been a lot of really interesting academic work, and we have worked with some partners to kind of reproduce and expand on that work and build it into our platform. So I wanted to just talk through what the state-of-the-art approaches are, how they work, and then share a little bit about what we've been doing on our side to advance and make more available these types of approaches to battery cycling procedures. So this is a bit of a different type of problem for us here at Aionics, because our efforts until recently really focused mostly on the design of materials. And if we're looking at battery applications in particular, there's all kinds of different materials that can be optimized. There's certainly, beyond battery applications as well, and basically anywhere where the configurations and types of atoms are a variable is something that a machine learning approach can be valuable for, assuming that there's, the right type of data and all those sorts of constraints. But if we just take a deep dive on batteries, because this is sort of what we've been on a kick with lately in our Fortnightlies, diving a little bit deeper. There's all kinds of components, right? So whether you're looking at electrodes or anodes, electrodes or electrolytes, there's additives, there's binders, there's active materials, all kinds of stuff, lots of stuff that's sort of ripe for optimization. And each of those things is usually sort of it's optimizing a piece of the larger puzzle to improve some kind of broader performance metric. But we can also optimize over what I would consider sort of the system level, which is basically optimizing over how you use the entire built thing once you have kind of decided on what the chemistry is that you want to use. So that includes things like the charge rate, the depth of discharge, the temperature, mechanical stress, all these questions that I often find myself asking, like, is it better for me to leave my laptop charger plugged in overnight or not? I don't think that there's a simple answer to that question. Really requires you to sort of know the performance characteristics of the battery, and that's kind of what we're talking about here with this whole cycle life stuff. So it's really kind of getting up to a higher level of optimization over our system. But it's really not that different in principle. So I want to start by comparing this to some of these case studies that we have worked on and shared on the materials side, with an example of solid electrolyte design and liquid electrolyte design. And in both cases, basically you have a bunch of data which correlate your inputs that you can control and your outputs that you care about. In the case of the solid electrolyte stuff, we have a fairly small data set, we'll say, on 40 known solid electrolyte materials, where we know their structure and we know their conductivity. And conductivity is what we want to optimize by changing the structure. So we take those 40 materials, we extract a number of features, which are just numerical representations of those structures. And that allows us to answer this question, which is basically, okay, well, if I have a new material, which one's more likely to be a good lithium ion conductor? And if I'm just looking at it naively in my head and I don't have kind of a model behind it, it's really hard for me to know. But these data-driven approaches, because they can find useful features for doing predictions of the properties we care about, can be really helpful for making that kind of prediction. And we have seen in this case of the solid electrolyte work that the model has a significantly improved capability of identifying good conductor materials over essentially a random search. And in some cases, in our comparisons, even better on average than the kind of average performance of a control group of PhD students. So this model was trained on a small amount of data, only 40 examples, 20 features, and seemed to do significantly better in predicting conductivity than a group of PhD students who know this field, but maybe don't know kind of all of those the highly dimensional feature space that the model is using for making these predictions. And the other case that I wanted to mention is liquid electrolyte design, which is basically the exact same workflow. So you have a bunch of data. In this case, we had about 200 unique electrolyte formulations and measured cycle life values, the question becomes, how do I correlate now that molecular structure with cycle life? That's the number that I care about. We went through this process of, again, extracting a number of features. In this case, we use the RD kit Mordred molecular featurizer, which gives us potentially over 1,000. Those then go into a model building framework where a model is trained to predict cycle life as a function of electrolyte composition. That then enables us to screen new candidates that will get us to good cycle life, and then we can go through and validate those predictions. And that's what we did here, and we estimated that this model trained on 200 data points was able to identify good electrolyte formulations with about a 10x improvement over guesswork. This is the kind of thing that we commonly do, where we're optimizing over information that's contained in some kind of chemical structure, whether that's a liquid electrolyte or a solid electrolyte or anything in between. Our problem statement for materials design is we're looking to build a function which maps structure to performance. Structure is molecular structure. And one example is what I just mentioned, which is what's the best electrolyte additive for my battery. This cell level design thing, now this is really a different type of function. It's still building a function. We're still mapping input to performance, but our input is now usage. So there's nothing about the chemistry here. It's all about the kind of characteristic usage profile that we're subjecting this thing to. And one example question would be, well, will my battery last longer if I fully discharge it before charging it again? Right. So just it's kind of different, a significantly different type of input data, but a similar kind of performance constraint that we're putting on our cells. Now, this question of cycle life prediction is very interesting. So I'll take a pause from talking about what we usually work on and how this is different, and just focus first on this problem of cycle life prediction. So cycle life or capacity fade, it's a super important metric for any battery. And you can think of this as, you buy a new cell phone and you charge it maybe overnight, every night, and after a certain amount of time, that battery just stops holding a charge. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 3 years. That's essentially the cycle life of the battery. And there's a huge problem, which is that number can vary significantly across batteries that seem to be identical. So they're nominally identical, same manufacturer, maybe coming off of the same manufacturing line, all of the same components, but one might last for a year, one might last for 2 years, and it's almost impossible to predict that ahead of time. And it's likely just due to kind of small defects in manufacturing that are kind of beyond our control. And so this is really a tough thing, and it's tough for the battery industry generally. We talked about this a little bit last week in the context of development cycles, and saying that anytime there's a tweak in the chemistry, you have to wait several months to know if that's going to improve your performance. And so that kind of slows down the progress of this entire field. So we had a way of predicting early on that, hey, this battery looks like it's going to last for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years. That would be super valuable. Because for one, we could just maybe throw bad cells away as they come off the manufacturing line. We could also, maybe you could notify the user that the cell seems like it's going to last so long. You could iterate more rapidly on chemistry changes by saying, okay, we only need to cycle this for a week rather than for 3 months. So it's a tough problem. It would be very valuable to be able to solve it. And the existing methods up until this paper was published didn't really seem, I should say, to do very well. So the seminal paper here is the one that I've cited down at the bottom, which was written through a collaboration with Stanford and MIT and the Toyota Research Institute, with this institute called the D3BAT, the Data-Driven Design of Lithium-Ion Batteries, which is this kind of academic and private partnership. And they took this problem on. And so here's an example of some of the data they generated, where they said, okay, here's a number of cells that have been cycled, and here's our discharge capacity on the y-axis. And for each cycle, so I have cycle number on the x-axis, that capacity is slowly fading. So this cell here in red performed the worst. We only got about 150 cycles out of it, whereas some of these cells cycled 1,000 times and they're still looking really good. And the problem up until this point is that most models have attempted to just extrapolate from early capacity data. But you can see that a lot of these cells will fail because they'll, in such a way that they'll be relatively constant for a while, and then they'll kind of catastrophically collapse. And so if you're extrapolating from this early data, you're missing, there's some information here that you're missing. Your extrapolation is just not going to capture that. So that motivated this team to say, okay, we can do better by using kind of more advanced data techniques. Okay, so their question was, can we predict failure within the first 100 cycles? So I'm just going to look at data in the first 100 cycles. I'm not going to look at anything that follows, and I'm going to see if I can tease something out from that. And that's roughly about the first 10% of life, because these things are lasting maybe about 1,000 cycles, maybe more. But here's several observations, which is that looking at the cycle-to-cycle data is just not too helpful. So if you try to just look at kind of where is the capacity sitting over the first 100 cycles, well, it doesn't really change much. So that's not a very good predictor. If you look at where is it sitting in the second cycle, that's also not very good. If you look at the slope, kind of right here at the end, that's also not very helpful for the reasons that these things seem to fail very quickly and very stochastically and catastrophically. So this paper began by looking at a number of those metrics and running a correlation analysis across the cells. And you can see here that basically, okay, none of these metrics work very well to explain the data. What you want to see is a nice diagonal line where your discharge capacity at cycle 2 is perfectly predictive of your cycle life, and you really don't see that. So as Leonardo would say, we need to go deeper in terms of we need to get more information out of the cells than we're able to get with the plot that you're seeing here. So the key that opens up this problem and makes it solvable is you have to look at the data within each cycle. And what I mean by that is the plot that you saw on the last slide was you would measure the capacity, you discharge the cell, you charge it again, and then you measure the capacity again. And so all of that behavior in the charging and discharging is basically lost because you're just taking a data point at the beginning or the end of each cycle. But what this team found is if you look at the current voltage profiles within each cycle, then you start to see some interesting information that can be learned or can be useful for learning, I should say. And they find in particular that there's this variance of the dQ/dV curves across basically cycle 100 with cycle 10. So each cycle gets you this kind of S-shaped curve, and if you look at the difference, so you subtract one from the other from a late cycle versus an early cycle, and then you take the variance of that difference. So this is like a pretty complex mathematical transformation that just the human eye would never really think to look at. Hey, here you actually end up with a pretty nice, highly correlated diagonal line. And the development of that feature was motivated by an understanding of how these systems fail. And so there's some domain expertise that motivated the idea to, hey, let's look at the difference between, voltage versus capacity, and then take the variance and XYZ. So there is a lot of domain expertise that's tied up here. And then they also tried a number of other features to see if that improved the model. They might help a little bit, but it appears that this variance of the charge versus voltage curve is really kind of capturing most of the variance in this model. And so really all I want to highlight is that this is, again, information that's captured in the first 100 cycles. So we've accomplished our goal of basically being able to predict early on what the kind of long-term behavior of the cell is going to be. We're seeing these indicators of failure coming early. Now, I'm excited to share that last summer, 2020, we worked with the cell manufacturer to essentially reproduce this model. And reproduce is a bit of a generous term because it wasn't an exact reproduction. It was inspired by that paper and similar. So in both cases, we're taking smart features built from the first kind of 10% of life to predict cycle life over the long run. And in this particular case, we had 72 cells in our training set, which had been cycled identically, and they were R&D cells, so they weren't super high performance cells. They were typically running from kind of 50 to about 200 cycles. And you can see that histogram there on the right that shows the distribution of cycles in that training set. I want to contrast this to, or compare this rather, to the original paper that had, I believe, 124 cells in the training set. So in both cases, we have a pretty small training set. This particular case is even smaller still. And we're really in that regime of small data where we're not always sure a priori if these models are going to work. But the use of smart features, which are grounded in domain expertise and in the physics of these processes, really helps us out when we have these small data sets. So 72 cells, for each of them, we computed 20 features from those current and voltage curves within the first 10% of life. In this case, since these batteries were fairly short-lived, those features were all computed within the first 10 cycles. And again, the features are based on the work that was done in that paper from MIT and Stanford. And then we fed those features into the platform, the Aionics platform, to build a fairly simple linear model with the features. And again, having good features, having smart features allows us to use fairly simple or high bias models for our predictions. So we built that model, we optimized it over the cross-validation error, and we got to a point with a subset of those features that looked to have some predictive power on this particular data set. Okay, so that gets us to the point where it looks like the model works, but we need to actually test it. So our partner then took data from, I think it was around 20 cells that had been cycled but left out of that training set. So this is our sort of holdout test set. And we predicted with the model what the cycle life would be versus what it actually was as it was measured. And as you can see here on this diagonal line, it's a very nice correlation. I think the average error was plus or minus 18 cycles out of a standard deviation of, I guess it was somewhere around 30 or 40. So our error is down to about 40% of the training standard deviation. So it looks really good. Looks good enough to be useful for our purposes. And to quantify how useful this is, if you consider that the average cycle life of these cells was 114 cycles, this model looks like it accelerates that testing by 11.4x because it enables predictions in the first 10, and on average, it would run to 114. So cutting out a ton of cycles that otherwise would be running there. And that means that in the future, as these new cells are produced and as they come off the line, well, you only need to run them through a cycle test of 10 cycles and featureize that data, plug it in to the platform either through API or through the browser, and get that lifetime prediction. And most importantly, I think where the really interesting kind of scientific value here is that it looks like this modeling process appears to generalize across chemistries. Now, in both cases, these were lithium cells, so there is some commonality in terms of that being the active species. But aside from that, really different anode, cathode, electrolyte, basically completely different chemistries there. So there is something that appears to be maybe universal, maybe semi-universal in this model. I think that's really cool validation for this team at Stanford and MIT that built this, that it looks like it stands up to this additional test. So this is really exciting, and it's motivated us to pursue this approach further and to integrate this onto the platform and offer it more broadly to customers, basically making it a permanent fixture of the platform. There's still very interesting open questions, I think, about how this sort of approach, what more can you do with this kind of approach? I think these are all exciting questions because they're potentially pointing us to broader and more valuable versions of this model, or of a similar model that can cut down development time significantly for batteries where cycle life is important. And these are things that I think we'll figure out in the coming years, whether that's in the academic world through the ongoing work of this initiative at Stanford, MIT, or through our partnerships with cell manufacturers. So it's a really exciting time, really interesting time to be in this field. And I'm happy to say that we're having some early success with these types of models. So with that, that is my final slide. I'll thank everyone for listening. I appreciate you being here, and we'll look forward to the next one. Thanks, everybody.